The debate rages on over abolishing the Senate. NDP leader Tom Mulcair has been at the forefront saying that an NDP government, if elected, would work to ensure its demise. But how likely is this? Just how possible is it? A pipe dream, perhaps? For that, we turn to Ed Prutschi, criminal defense lawyer, but also constitutional expert, I'm sure. Ed, let's start with that. What would it take to abolish the Senate?
Well, you said it right there in the introduction, constitutional law. That's where we're at right now. The Senate is not something you can just get rid of at the whim of the ruling party. In fact, the ruling party, the Conservatives, went to the Supreme Court of Canada to try to get clarification about this because there was a desire to at least reform, if not outright abolish. And on that, what's called a reference case of the Supreme Court came back and unanimously indicated, no, it doesn't work that way. If you're going to abolish the Senate, you're going to need parliamentary approval and legislative approval from every province all across the country. So you need every premier signing off, and you've got to open up the Constitution and make your amendments there. That makes it a lot closer to impossible and closer to pipe dream than anything else.
And why specifically?
Look, unanimity is always difficult to get. Maybe the complete disaster that the Senate has become is one of the few issues that Canadians are unanimous about. But if you start talking to some of the smaller provinces, the Atlantic provinces in particular, even though people there and perhaps governments there are fed up with the Senate, much like everybody else is, from their perspective, they do get a sort of an outsized hammer, an outsized level of clout with which they can deal with legislation relative to their populations. Because when a small province like Prince Edward Island has, I believe, 4 senators, for example, that gives it a fair bit of opportunity to speak out on legislation that they wouldn't get otherwise as a province of only a few thousand people. So there may well be a scenario where people say in the smaller provinces, we don't like the Senate, but on the other hand, we don't like the idea of giving up our loudest voice in the parliamentary process.
Warren Kinsella, liberal strategist, I found this interesting. He wrote a piece in which he argued that Tom Mulcair may lack the constitutional means, but if the election becomes a referendum on it, it's moot because no premier would oppose it. Do you buy into this argument if we put it to a referendum?
Look, Warren is a very smart guy from the perspective of political strategy, and he may well be right that it becomes very difficult politically for politicians to back away if, in fact, a referendum says what we all think it's going to say, which is that Canadians overwhelmingly support abolition of the Senate. And when I say overwhelmingly, I mean that includes Ontario, BC, throughout Quebec, which is always its own sort of distinct question, all the way across through the Maritimes. Legally, though, that has no implications, right? From the perspective of the courts, something doesn't become legal just because everybody wants it to be legal. That's up to Parliament to make that decision, and through our constitutional process, the input of the provinces is necessary. What it does do, though, is potentially give the hammer to premiers to say, you know what, we will support unanimously the constitutional amendment required because a referendum demonstrates to us that everybody, including our own constituents, the people who vote us in and out in our bread and butter, are also in favor of this.
The other thing that we haven't talked about yet, but I think is still a very important problem in trying to amend the Constitution this way and ultimately abolish the Senate, though we haven't yet talked about reform, is when you say to provinces, we want to get you on board, they may come back at you and say, okay, well, we'll get on board, but we have a whole bunch of other we have a whole bunch of other demands. So this whole process will get bogged down in additional demands by the provinces while the Constitution is open.
Well, it's the old what's in it for me, right? I mean, that's what politics is all about, the art of the possible. So as soon as you get into the question of saying we're going to reopen the Constitution, something that very rarely happens, is nearly unprecedented, and you get into that scenario, we're going to run and do that, the question now becomes, well, what are people going to ask for? What's the quid pro quo? Quebec always comes to the table asking for something. I don't blame them for that. That's the art of realpolitik, and I suspect that every province is going to say, whether it's a question of transfer payments, whether it's a question of healthcare support, whether it's a question of a louder voice in the Parliament because the Senate is now being abolished, do they want more electoral votes within their particular province? Do they want to send more MPs to Ottawa? There are so many things that could come into play here that for a prime minister to corral and herd all those cats, extraordinarily difficult.
The Auditor General report confirmed what most people thought about the Senate, which is there is a massive culture of entitlement. You've got senators expensing golf with their buddies, 2 homes, questionable travel. So most people, I think, might get behind wanting to abolish the Senate. For sure, there's not a tremendous amount of love for the Senate. But what about reforming the Senate? It's my understanding, though I'm not a constitutional expert, you would only need 7 of the 10 provinces to get on board with that. What realistic reforms could be done, if any?
So when you get into the question of tinkering with the Senate as opposed to outright abolition, it might be a little bit easier. There's an argument to be made that you require 2/3 of the provinces, so 7 out of 10 in this circumstance, comprising at least 50% of the population. That gives you an opportunity to potentially marginalize some of the smaller Atlantic provinces if you can get the big bodies on board. Now, when you talk about population, that always means Quebec needs to be on board as well, and Quebec is always its own unique challenge. When we talk about what kinds of reforms are going to be made, that's anyone's guess. It can mean maybe the Prime Minister ought not to be appointing them. Maybe we want an elected Senate. People have talked about that. The old Triple E Senate question. Maybe we want to directly elect our senators. Maybe we want it to come from the House of Commons. Maybe we want each party to be able to appoint a certain number. Maybe we want to change around the representation a little bit in terms of what provinces they come from.
We could do what Justin Trudeau did, which is to make them independent.
Right, so they're not caucus-based. I mean, they're independent in name only. The reality is they immediately reconstituted under sort of a small L liberal banner. So I'm not sure what value there is to that, because you do have a certain allegiance to whoever appoints you. And the way the Constitution reads now, the sole purview for appointees to the Senate is the Prime Minister. That's Stephen Harper. And he's very reluctant to do so. If we look back at recent history, we haven't appointed a senator in quite some time. And the senators who were appointed have been quite an embarrassment. There's a deficiency now of about, I think, 20 some odd open seats in the Senate. And within a number of years, because of the mandatory retirement, that's going to grow to over 30. In a Senate that I think only has 130 seats, we're getting dangerously close to a situation in which the Senate becomes sort of a shadow of its former body. And that raises all sorts of difficult questions.
That's a good point. If Stephen Harper continues to not appoint senators, could he abolish the Senate by just leaving these vacancies?
Yeah, so the question of abolition by neglect is a difficult one, because the Prime Minister has an obligation legally to appoint senators. I mean, that's what the Constitution says. It's his responsibility as Prime Minister to do that. He's been turning that down, and he gets criticism no matter which way he chooses. When he appoints a senator, everybody points to him and says, hey, you ought not to be doing that. This organization, this body is corrupt and useless. And yet if he doesn't, legal scholars turn to him and say, hey, the Senate still has a mandatory role in our parliamentary democracy. You cannot pass legislation without a functional Senate. So if it's dysfunctional politically, at some point when you lose enough members, it's going to become dysfunctional legally. Then you can't pass anything.
Without a doubt, there are a lot of legal questions, as evidenced by our discussion. Ed, final question, yes or no, is the Senate here to stay?
Yes, I think it is. I think in one form or another it's just too difficult for us to get rid of the Senate. I think you're going to see continuing demands for reform, and I also think that the Auditor General's report, so this $21 million or $23 million that has been spent to uncover about $1 million in waste, has accomplished at least one thing.
For a body that's $1 million or $100 million a year.
Right, but if anybody gets appointed to Senate at some point in the future, no one's going to get appointed before the election, I can guarantee you that. But whoever wins the election is probably going to have to reopen that question and start appointing somebody. But you can bet that the new class of senators, whoever that may be, are going to be absolutely scrupulously terrified of the kind of scrutiny that's going to be held over them. So whoever the sort of rookie senators are, the class of 2016, those senators I think are going to act very differently with respect to public funds. They're going to have to, and it's going to be up to the media and the public and the government to make sure that that's not a temporary thing, that it's not, by 2018 back to the bad old days of 2015.
One would hope. All right, Ed.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you for your expertise.
You're welcome.